south of where that yellow marker is, where you can see the ridge of Darjeeling, is kind of really blanketed in tea plantations, and to some extent around the ridge of Darjeeling. So just kind of panning around, you can kind of see the relationship between the ridge and the plains, and kind of where that river sits vis-a-vis the rest of the landscape. And now I want to move from Darjeeling, and the site of most of my my research in the past, to Kalimpong, and the site of my new research. Sorry if this is making anyone dizzy. To Kalimpong. So again, on the other side of the river, high up on this ridge, on the other side of the Teesta River. And unlike Darjeeling, right, which is blanketed mostly in plantations, Kalimpong, this side of the river, is kind of mostly agricultural, and to some extent forest. So this side of this region is occupied primarily by smallholder agriculturalists. And this was like a deliberate colonial project. And I'm gonna actually talk about that kind of throughout the rest of my paper. So now I kind of wanna span around here just to give you some kind of, for those of you unfamiliar with the region, kind of where we are in the world and kind of what the topography and landscape is. You kind of see the district, which is actually not even all on the screen, undulating down to the plains. And on the more southern face of Darjeeling, let me stop it there, is the place I'll kind of talk mostly about today. And that is the second yellow dot, what's kind of in the contemporary period called the seed farm. In the historical period that I'll be talking about as well, it was the Kalimpong demonstration farm. And it's a farm, a huge agricultural extension experimental station that kind of spans from that yellow dot, the seed farm, all the way down to the Teesta River, to the far right side of your screen, but to the Reli River, which is kind of here in the valley there. So it moves from the yellow dot all the way down to the valley. And that's kind of this little, like a strip of land, if you can imagine, from that yellow dot down to the river, is what we'll be talking about today. So that is where we are in the world. Now I'm going to escape out of this and get into this. And that was my transition. Okay, so I came to this project and to Kalimpong having spent a lot of time thinking about social reproduction on plantations and questions of how tea workers live their lives and care for their families in the spaces outside of the tea fields in which they worked. Questions of production and reproduction, and really the collapse of these categories, got me to thinking about the crops that circulate around the region, right, that are grown and circulate around the region, but that often don't count in narratives of agriculture, really in narratives at all about the region, right? Or they don't count in narratives of colonial or post-colonial governance. So these are things like celery and cardamom, flowers, particularly gladioli, as well as mulberry and maize. And I couldn't find my picture of celery, so I'm using some raisog and simraya to kind of stand in for these kind of locally circulating crops. So what I'm asking then is, what would a feminist political economic take on labor and agriculture centering crops like these, and not plantation crops like tea and cinchona, tell about the region? Like, what other kind of stories can we tell of the region? So it's important to note too that residents of Kalimpong describe their home as a kind of green belt, a contrast and outside to the plantations. Kalimpong is home to a patchwork of small farmers operated by Nepali, Lepcha, and Bhutia families. But the region was settled, like scare quoted, settled in colonial parlance in a manner distinct from the plantations. So a kind of bit of historical background here. Kalimpong was part of a large swath of territory that the British annexed from the Kingdom of Bhutan in 1865. While European companies quickly leased much of this land for tea plantations, Kalimpong became a government estate, as you see in the kind of slide, where a series of cadastral surveys divided the forts and forests of Bhutanese territory into individual landholdings. Local land agents recruited peasant farmers from low caste and tribal groups in Nepal, as well as indigenous Lepcha and Bhutia people to work on this estate. Farmers' right to occupy land was tied to their willingness to turn forest into productive farms, to contribute labor to the construction and maintenance of roads, and to pay rents. The vegetables, fruits, and grains farmers produced would supply the food for the growing plantations on the other side of the river in Darjeeling and expanding urban centers across Bengal. Okay, so a central mechanism of settlement was agricultural extension. Extension, by which I kind of mean the provision of free and subsidized seeds and implements and education aimed at farmers about how to use all those things, was an experimental process that sought to optimize farmers' productivity. Colonial agricultural extension had a dual purpose too, of setting land rents across Kalimpong based on those calculations of optimal productivity. So a central node in extension work was the Kalimpong demonstration farm, which you kind of see an image of here. And that's that farm that I kind of pointed out on that southern side of the ridge, now known as the seed farm, which is funded by the colonial government in Bengal and run by the Church of Scotland's St. Andrew's Colonial Homes and its leader, the Reverend John Graham. The demonstration farm, now run by the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, or ICAR, is still oriented to increasing the productivity of land and labor in the hills. So St. Andrew's Colonial Homes, or just Dr. Graham's Homes as it's now known, it became one of the most well-known schools for Anglo-Indian children. At the school, pupils, many of whom were the progeny of white planters and civil servants, learned vocational skills and Protestant comportment that would allow them to serve the empire as productive workers. Boys were taught agriculture and other trades, while women were taught handicrafts and service work, namely nannying and nursing. Recent scholarship has described how some home students were resettled in British colonies, from New Zealand to Canada, to kind of work in their newfound trades. What I want to do with this project and kind of this research is to think with settlement directly and the intersections of the homes and their vocational training programs and this nexus of church, state, agricultural extension, to understand how these projects and logics have shaped agrarian land and livelihoods in Kalimpong as opposed to outside of it. So why agricultural extension? Well, the Kalimpong government estate was surveyed and settled every 10 years, and at which time the British settlement officer set higher rents and deeded out new plots to those who had settled since the previous settlement, so in those intervening 10 years. So between surveys, demonstration and experimentation at the farm worked to recalibrate the maximum rents that the colonial state could extract from farmers in these kind of different ecological zones in Kalimpong. Historians describing agrarian contexts in Bengal generally have noted that settlement was about maximizing productivity. More agricultural production meant more land under settlement, meant more rents. So while it is certainly the case that settlement was productivist, I want to use ethnographic and historical methods to ask how settlement shaped life more broadly. Because if demonstration facilitated settlement, what facilitated demonstration? This is kind of a more historical question. My ethnographic questions kind of center on trying to understand how extension is a kind of tentacular project that shapes the present. How did the racialized and gendered work of the homes and agricultural extension in particular shape everyday life in Kalimpong and Kalimpong in the past, as well as what are the legacies of that work in the present? And how do farmers in Kalimpong look back at the past and consider the present of settlement? A lot of the questions I'm trying to explore are those that people in Kalimpong have asked me about land, land tenure, and rent. Right? These are not, of course, like super hot or super sexy topics in contemporary anthropology these days. But they are instead questions that people themselves ask of the archives and ask of spaces to which they do not have access. Okay, so now I want to tell a story about agricultural extension. So Henry Raymond Edmonds, here with a pit helmet, was born around 1888. most likely on a tea plantation in the Dooars region of what is now West Bengal. The son of a white father and an Indian mother, he would have been labeled by the colonial establishment as a half-caste, a Eurasian child. His documented life begins in an orphanage run by the American Protestant Mission in the Bengal Administrative Center of Asansol in the early 1900s. Despite these humble beginnings, by 1922, he had become the superintendent of agriculture for the Darjeeling district. And in 1935, he was given an MBE for his services to imperial agronomy. Today, Edmonds is nearly forgotten, both in India and in Britain. The remains of his biography is available only in fragments. Yet his story, that of an orphaned Anglo-Indian child who became a senior civil servant and scientist in the British colonial bureaucracy, is instructive for understanding the racial logics and practices of colonial land acquisition and settlement on India's geographical margins. And I first learned of Henry Edmonds from a series of annual reports he wrote as the manager of the Kalimpong demonstration farm. So when the Kalimpong demonstration farm opened in 1907, it sloped down from the bazaar to the banks of the Reli River, as I kind of pointed out in that Google Earth slide, thousands of feet below. And here you can see in this image the relationship of the homes, right, the boarding school, to the demonstration farm on the bottom of your screen. And a lot of the images I'm going to show today are actually from the Edmonds family archive. Okay, so this kind of geographical distribution, this setting on the ridge, made the farm representative of the various varied soil types, slopes, and altitudes in which Kalimpong's farmers worked. Today, the demonstration farm's landmass is considerably smaller. Since Indian independence in 1947, it has made way to new and expanded villages, but the site still houses ICAR's agricultural experimental station. Before the farm, in 1900, Reverend John Graham established the St. Andrew's Colonial Homes, which was initially devoted exclusively to the education of Anglo-Indian children. Graham's aim was to ensure that these children became productive citizens of the empire. Graham's mission took on the rhetoric of rescue and rehabilitation. He described his work with the progeny of white colonists as a duty. Central to his educational approach was housing students in cottages, as you see here, to which they would affix a new familial identity. The central figure in this family was the European mother or auntie, who was in charge of each cottage. So a surrogate family headed by a desexualized European matriarch was intended not just to domesticate, but to racialize. The homes advertised itself to potential donors across India and Europe as an effective solution to what was termed the Eurasian question. Graham's promotional material explained that the homes were testing a belief that by separating the Anglo-Indian progeny of planters from their social context and relocating them to both the rigid order of European education and the redemptive climate of the hills, these children could be schooled into whiteness. So much as agricultural extension work and demonstration work sought to cultivate faith in the efficacy of new technologies, in the efficacy of new seeds and techniques amongst farmers, Graham's experiment was on faith in the malleability of race. The demonstration farm brought these two projects of faith together. But as I mentioned earlier, Graham's efforts to use agricultural education and experimentation to improve the lives of, improve kind of problematically, to improve the lives of Nepali, Lepcha, and Bhutia peoples and peasants who lived in Kalimpong is less well known. It was in Kalimpong and on the demonstration farm that the educational mission of the colonial bureaucracy and the Protestant mission converged. So too did Christian redemption coincide with the redemption of Anglo-Indian men through work on Kalimpong's farmers and on their crops. Okay. So the heart of the demonstration farm and agricultural extension here in Kalimpong was the demonstration ground, which you can kind of see here as the kind of flat part betwixt those buildings, or that all the buildings kind of face onto here as an image. This is the image of the buildings on the demonstration farm. So at this demonstration ground, farmers would come here to Kalimpong to collect seeds, either at no cost or highly subsidized, and learn how to care and care for them and plant them. The government funded this project, right? The colonial government of Bengal underwrote this project with the primary objective of propagating English fruit trees, including apricots, plums, and walnuts grown from seedlings from the royal nurseries at Maidstone in England. These fruits were to be sold to the European occupants of Darjeeling and Kalimpong. The harvesting season of many of these English fruits, too, corresponded with the time of the year that colonial administration shifted to the hills. But over the first 5 years, these fruit experiments largely failed. The farm was more successful, however, at least in the short term, in improving the performance of staple grain crops, the main market for which was not the European elite, but the growing Nepali, as well as Lepcha and Bhutia population on and off the plantation. Buckwheat, corn, and millet, along with lentils and soybeans, were grown on terraced and unterraced, irrigated and unirrigated plots at all of those different altitudes. Experimentation in these early years focused a great deal on maize, which was one of the kind of key crops that I'm interested in this larger project. So focus on maize, and the elaboration of techniques for growing the crop became the demonstration farm's first kind of self-proclaimed success. Maize, unlike rice, which is another kind of key crop in the region, especially before 1900, maize, unlike rice, could be intercropped with millet or soybeans. And so the 1913 annual report of the Kalimpong demonstration farm suggested that if farmers dedicated their fields to maize and millet, so intercropped maize and millet, instead of growing rice, then the government could be entirely justified in charging 1 rupee per acre rent to cultivators, which would have been double, which was double, the 8 ana rent for the category of productive land that had been established a decade earlier. Okay, so Henry Edmonds, again here in the middle in his pit helmet, was one of the first graduates, or the first students to graduate from the homes. Unlike many of the subsequent graduates, though, Edmonds was not resettled abroad. With the agronomic training he received at the homes, Edmonds went on to operate a farm of an English couple living elsewhere in Bengal. Amidst this, as well, Edmonds studied and passed the civil service examinations and soon secured a job and a place within the Bengal Agricultural Department. So a star pupil and favorite of Dr. Graham, right, his first graduate anyway, right? So it's kind of emblematic kind of student. In 1914, the homes hired Edmonds to manage the demonstration farm. Edmonds enacted several changes at the farm and further expanded the experimental program into fruits and vegetables, or kind of re-brought in fruits, again, as you see here. The farm even distributed or sold at like concessionary prices the seedlings of foreign vegetables to try to kind of stoke people growing so-called foreign vegetables in Kalimpong. Edmonds also, according to people who knew him, was central in the training of those would-be resettled laborers abroad. Edmonds also greatly expanded demonstration work. Under his leadership, farmers were joined by local school groups from across Kalimpong in live demonstrations on the demonstration ground. School children took home seeds with the hope of distributing them to their parents and their parents' neighbors. The children were encouraged to explain the use of these new seeds, the cultivation methods, and the market for these plants. Right, this dissemination strategy still remains popular in development practice today. Edmonds maintained, too, that maize should remain the cornerstone of the agrarian economy in Kalimpong. In the 1924 annual report of the demonstration farm, which he wrote that when intercropped with millet in particular, maize was how most farmers in the region could make a living. And so Edmonds oversaw the distribution of tens of thousands of pounds of high yielding seeds, particularly for maize. Edmonds even earned the title of Mr. Maize at the homes, or so they say. In 1928, the Bengal Agricultural Department actually kind of took over the farm and subleased it, the entirety of the farm, from Dr. Graham's homes. But Edmonds stayed on as manager and soon became the superintendent of agriculture for the district of Darjeeling, but again, stayed the manager of the farms in his position as superintendent. And as superintendent, he set up 4 satellite demonstration centers on the most kind of distant margins of Kalimpong, in Pedong, Gitbyong, Nimbong, and Yogyakarta. To oversee the new demonstration centers and to help with the kind of practical work of demonstration in these rural sites, Edmonds appointed Jit Bahadur Limbu, who had worked at the farm for many years prior, as well as Daniel Junibu, who was from Nimbong, a farmer from Nimbong. Edmonds, along with Limbu and Junibu, traveled to these locations quite regularly across the district, doing demonstrations and presentations and distributing seeds to farmers there. And as well, so as these 3 men kind of went out, so too did farmers from each of these 4 satellite locations come to the demonstration farm regularly to learn about and bring seeds back to their farms. And so farmers were kind of appointed as specialists in a particular category of crop. So there was farmers who worked on maize, and as you kind of see in this image, farmers who worked with vegetables or millet, or kind of other categories of crop, and they became kind of like demonstration specialists in these particular crops, kind of moving between the farms, the demonstration farm and their farms, bringing kind of this demonstration knowledge back to their villages. So as with school children who visited the demonstration farm, the idea was that these farmers kind of appointed and anointed as kind of as maize specialists or millet specialists. They were armed with these new seeds and these techniques for one particular crop, and go back and train their kin and neighbors. Edmonds judged from the growth of pucka houses, right, that he was writing in his own reports, he judged from the growth of pucka houses in these remote villages in Kalimpong that extension work was having a desired effect, kind of congratulatory. And that desired effect was permanently settling a population of rent-paying peasants and rent-paying ryots, and who were insulated against food insecurity. So the Kalimpong demonstration farm and the work of figures like Henry Edmonds transformed the countryside. It worked to bring the annexed lands of the Bengal Dooars into imperial governance. But in 1940, Edmonds retired from the agricultural department, and the publication of these annual reports, which are actually really quite rich in detail, ceased. The results of Edmonds' work, however, are infused in Kalimpong's contemporary landscape. Plots of maize dot the landscape, and they remain the food of subsistence in the village. Seed farm managers are still referred to as Makai Babu or Makai Baji, right? Makai being corn in Nepali, Baji being a sign of respect, but Babu a sign of respect, Baji meaning grandfather. So the Henry Edmonds story is just a taste of some of the archival materials I've been kind of thinking about and working with regard to agricultural extension in Kalimpong. My plan is to go back to Kalimpong, right, whenever that may be, to do ethnographic work with the descendants and neighbors of the farmers who kind of were working in these satellite villages of demonstration work, to kind of understand the project of settlement and the project of extension more generally. And today, I'm going to just kind of go back to this historical image for just a second. The remains of the seed farm, the remains of the demonstration farm are still visible across the road from the Government of India's ICAR agricultural extension facility. So just kind of contrasting pictures. Here's the old, demonstration farm, and here is the image of a contemporary image of the demonstration ground. The farm is not the only evidence of the enduring influence of the colonial logic of settlement in Kalimpong. Much of the land on which farmers live and work is leased from the government, which still calculates rents based on the projections of the market value of maize or millets, fruits, and vegetables. So attention to the plantation's outsides has some political implications for the present. In a world where there seems to be fewer and fewer spaces outside of commodity capitalism, how does the deliberate construction of such outsides help us understand the violence, racial orders, and ecological practices that have been created to prop that capitalist system up? In contemporary anthropology, colonial and capitalist agriculture is often caricatured as a process of carving out monocultures. Capitalist agriculture is neo-colonial insofar as it perpetuates and extends monoculture. This means that in much scholarly and popular discourse, the small farmer must either be victim to this continued expansion or a redemptive antidote to it. So the case of Kalimpong is illustrative of the way in which small-scale, more seemingly biodiverse modes of agricultural production were and continue to be adjacent to, but not separate from, the growth and persistence of the plantation. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. On behalf of the 70 or so other folks here, thank you very much for that presentation. Want to let everyone know, if you have some questions, please type them into the Q&A. I'll be speaking them for you. Our first question, we already have one in from Kath March, who asked, who was living and how in the Kalimpong area before colonial agricultural demonstrations and rent-producing settlement?
So that's a great question that I'm actually trying to piece together to the best extent possible. It was, so Kalimpong, along with the region that's known as the Dooars, was all part of Bhutanese territory that the British annexed in 1865. So prior to 1860, so here's the kind of historical kind of short form chronology. 1865 is annexation, Kalimpong, the formation of the Kalimpong, the formation of the Bengal Agricultural Department in the wake of several famines is in the late 1880s, as is the first settlement of Kalimpong. So prior to 1865 and the annexation, this is actually just pretty sparsely populated agricultural land. The kind of key geographical features of which are these kind of forts that kind of sit at the peaks of the Dooars, the kind of the doors into Bhutan. And so Kalimpong was just a small hamlet that kind of grew into this this large, this hill station. But in terms of like historical material that I can find that isn't written by colonial sources on this area pre-1865, I'm having a really hard time to kind of really have a rich understanding of what was kind of going on pre-1865. There's a lot on the stealing of this land by the British Army, but not really any Bhutanese sources on it that I've had access to. I'm sure there are. I have not had access to that.
All right. If there are other questions, please type them into the Q&A and we'll address them as they come in. I was curious, a question about actually I have a question from Harijit Jha. He's wondering how productivity is being defined in these agricultural systems. Are productive agricultural practices predefined by colonial officials? Are local and small-scale farmers also defining agricultural productivity that will later be scaled up?
That's a great question. And like the definitions of productive and unproductive and wasteland become quite codified after the first settlement of Kalimpong, so after the 1880s. And so there's different rents set for productive and unproductive land. Kind of the highest rents are set, well, the highest rents are set for cardamom lands, that's kind of an asterisk there. But the second highest rents are set for what the British define as productive land. And so part of the work of experimentation is to think about what constitutes productive land, right? So it's kind of an experiment. So what interests me kind of conceptually and theoretically is that experimentation is on the very idea of what constitutes productivism, right? From the settlement logic itself. So, I mean, what I would like to kind of do in the larger project is see how the emic categories of productivism or emic critiques of those colonial productivist logics, like what they might be. But heretofore, like what I've looked at is that productive, unproductive, and waste are very, and many people have written about kind of waste, but this productive and unproductive land categories are very much constructed through demonstration and through settlement too.
Next question from Nidhi Subramaniam versus, thank you, Professor Besky, for your presentation and welcome to Cornell. She asks, how did the plantation economy in the broader region compete with this nascent agricultural economy to recruit labor? How was labor recruitment changing, if you know?
Also really, really interesting. So historical in terms of like kind of historical movements, a lot of the plantations are set up before the formal settlement of Kalimpong. So in Darjeeling in particular. So this is, so 1880s, you're seeing the first settlement of Kalimpong. So many tea workers who had made enough, money to get off of the plantation, right? Which is like workers are making next to no money, but like, so what I have seen is post 1882, and mostly anecdotal evidence of this, workers who had been working in the plantation for some amount of time, whether it's one season or multi seasons, are resettling in Kalimpong as agriculturalists, because kind of the promise of British recruitment onto plantations was that of having being able to kind of produce one's own food, right? Because prior to the kind of setup of most of the plantations in Darjeeling, in Nepal, the British monarch is pushing or is resettling high caste Hindus onto land that is kind of pushing many other Nepali settlers to making them look to Darjeeling and looking to the plantation. So to some extent, there is actually, I would say, the settlement drew workers from the plantations in this kind of mid 1880s to 1900 period. At what incidents, like how much, like that's something that I would like to kind of think more about. But the other kind of confluence of the plantation and the non-plantation that I'm really interested in is the what's called the Darjeeling Improvement Fund, which was a fund that was set up for many things, but primarily to make markets, like to literally set up markets and to pay people to upkeep them, and they were kind of set up in kind of deliberate areas adjacent to the plantations, such that workers could buy kind of basic grains and basic grains mostly. And so understanding the flows from Kalimpong, right, food producers via these markets to the plantation is there and very much in fragments in the archive, and it's something that I would like to kind of think more about.
We have a question from Nirvan Pradhan, who asks, can you shed more light on the gendered education of children in Dr. Graham's home school and the role of the Church of Scotland in it?
There's like 7 books on that. Like, I remember, like, there are 7 books you can write on that. I mean, like, it's so interesting, right? Like these like hard and fast rules about the relationship between gender and work. And like boys will be trained in agriculture, and they will be trained in trades like metalsmithing, blacksmithing, baking. So that was in practical trades. And women will be trained in things that they can do with their hands, and then their motherly care, i.e. nursing and nannying. And there's still like remnants of this at the school today, right? There's the shop, there's still a nanny training program, right? And very famous affluent Indians have come to Kalimpong in the recent past to secure a well-trained nanny. And so, I mean, so they're like, there's these questions that I would love to ask us, like, so, and one of the things that like just super micro detail that I think is so interesting about the homes and women's education in particular is the production of lace. And so a lot of energy and a lot of money was put into lace training programs, and actually trying to make a model lace training program in Kalimpong that could be kind of exported elsewhere in India, to train particularly tribal women in how to make lace and how to kind of be productive for the empire. And secondly, another kind of interesting thing about the vocational training programs and the gendered work is that these were keyed into labor shortages in places like New Zealand and Australia. So they weren't just like women are good at, it was none, like they're also deliberately kind of pointed to, like there's agricultural labor shortages in New Zealand, or there's a need for handicraft and nannying work in New Zealand, just for example. And so like these vocational training programs were also keyed into labor shortages in other colonial contexts and settler colonial contexts, right? Because the whole point of resettlement was that you would get trained in a trade, and you would take your trade to, say, New Zealand, and your children would be quote unquote born Britons, right? You could pass as white, you could pass as like almost white, and then your children would be like proper Britain. So
Did any of
there's a
those,
lot there.
did any of those people who resettled like have memoirs, or you see records of what their memories of Kalimpong?
Yeah, and there's actually some really new, interesting work done by a historian, Jane McCabe, who has kin ties to one of the resettled workers in New Zealand. And so many of the workers went to New Zealand primarily for agriculture and service work. And so yeah, there's been, and there's great archives and oral histories that have been done within the kind of resettled communities, and like it's amazing. It's really great work. And so, but the question is like, what happened to all the people who didn't go? That's kind of my question. Because like once they left for good. They don't come back. That was the point of resettlement into these settler colonies. So yeah, there's most of the work has been done in New Zealand.
Oh, cool. So we have a lot of questions about land. Let's see, Jigme Lama asks, was there any opposition to the creating of farms by the Bhutias and Lepchas, as many of the lands are termed as sites of guardian deities?
I know that anecdotally. I want to know more. And because believe it or not, like, so most of the work that most of the sources that I've been able to access are kind of the paper, the massive amount of paper produced by the Bengal Agricultural Department. And they even talk about such resistance, but that's kind of what I really want to kind of do with this project, is to kind of think about how like the resistance to settlement as a particular kind of logic. So yes, I've heard this, but like I want to know more, and I want to kind of understand. And this is kind of where myself not being a trained historian, like working as an anthropologist and like trying to anthropologize the past, right, and to kind of work across these historical and ethnographic methods, where like that would be like, this is a great like example of a site that to kind of understand contestation around the very kind of concept of settlement, right? Like what is this question about productivity? Like how do these kind of like these concepts that are held fast by British administration, settlement, production, productivism, where do they fall apart, and how are they resisted in everyday life in Kalimpong?
And on that issue of land rights, I'm combining questions from Vivek Tamanga and Diki Sherpa. So how did the colonial land legislation interact with existing customary land law and the rights of the people working on the farms?
So there's multiple ways to answer that. The way that I'll kind of like just start is the thing that I know most about is about rent extraction. And so the British, to some extent, in the way they settled Kalimpong, tried to kind of work within the existing Bhutanese, like the Bhutanese poll tax system, in which like certain people, like heads were taxed as opposed to lands were taxed. Like this, so what's kind of interesting is this kind of tension between like the object of a tax. So how, like, because it's the land that's like, at least in settlement, right, that is the object of the tax. And so I mean, so what I have seen historically is kind of this like how to shift categories from person to tax. So, but yeah, that's, and again, I wish I had richer kind of historical documents from the pre-1865 period. But so there's kind of, yeah, there's something there. I'm not really satisfyingly answering your question, because it's actually really, really huge, and I could spend a whole hour on it.
Well, we have another question about land. Is from David Holmberg, who remarks that colonial agrarian regimes usually replicated patterns in Europe, where owners of land and workers of the land were quite distinct. Those who worked the land didn't own it. Could you elaborate a bit on the question of ownership? You mentioned corvée-like obligations in return for labor. Who were the owners? Was it, you mentioned in passing, like, that the government owned all the land? So
government was the sole owner of the land, like full stop, period. In a government estate, like these are all land rent, like even so it's a riot system, right? These are peasant farmers that do not own their land. They pay taxes based on how productive it is, and what category that has been put onto that land. In settlement documents, it's kind of written in this kind of turgid bureaucraties, but one of the clearest things that is articulated is like the sole landowner is the government.
And is that still true?
So that's what's kind of the interesting thing, thinking about how settlement practices affect the present. People are really kind of stuck in somewhat confusing land rent relationships. I mean, a great example is, I mean, I mentioned the DI fund in the Darjeeling Improvement Fund in relation to another question, but that these market areas around Kalimpong and actually across the whole of Darjeeling have these particular, these very high land rents that are kind of set to ideas about how much you could sell stuff on that land, right? So particular ideas about the land's optimal, that these like town or bazaar kind of based land's optimal productivity. And this is something that actually tenant rights organizations, lawyers, there's been court cases going on for like years now about trying to recategorize land, like to get land that is in this category into another category, for just to kind of not mire you with details.
Yeah.
So to kind of recategorize land is that we're set in settlement period is something that people are actively still trying to do, not particularly successfully, unfortunately.
Wow. So we have a few questions about contemporary issues. Ritu Mangar asks, will you also look into the problem of shortage of agricultural laborers that has become a concern for the small scale farmers since quite some time in Kalimpong, which has impacted the agricultural work?
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of actually look at all of the kind of challenges or how farmers articulate what the challenges to staying settled, for lack of a better word, on their land are, right? Landslides are one of those things, and land degradation, farm worker shortage, farm worker surplus, depending on kind of where you are, like who is the right kind of worker for your farm. Those are kind of, questions that I would like to kind of think about, right? Settlement in the broader project, right? Settlement in this dual purpose, right? Settlement as a very much a codified colonial category, but settlement in a way kind of, or to be settled as a kind of contemporary aspiration, or to stay on one's land, to belong on one's land, to own, right, whatever that might mean, one's land, and the challenges to that. So yes, but also but situating that within a suite of other challenges that people in agrarian contexts say that are their problems.
Okay, so even further, Yoja Kamang says, thank you for this enriching presentation. If we see the pattern of seasonal migration from Nepal to Darjeeling and Kalimpong, what I've noticed is seasonal migration of women is more towards Darjeeling, whereas in Kalimpong, there are only men who seasonally migrate for work. Is it because Darjeeling has a plantation economy, whereas Kalimpong lacks it? Could you shed light on the gendered aspect of migration?
Oh, that's really interesting. And again, being quite new to the Kalimpong scene, I actually know more about the Darjeeling migrations for Darjeeling than I do about Kalimpong. But I think that migration is seasonal, and I think with COVID, with there's and having it a lot tied to the tourism industry, at least in my experience with portering, rock breaking, these kinds of manual forms of labor, right, that are seemingly gender non-discriminatory, but do kind of fall along gendered lines in particular ways at particular times. Honestly, it's just not something I looked at, but that's, to me, a lot of the seasonal migration, I don't think about it as, depending on where the plantation is in relation to the Nepal border, that is a different kind of question. But when I think about seasonal labor, the seasonal laborers that I often most talk to and think about their stories is our porters, and which are so tied to the tourism industry, which is right sitting right now, what's their livelihoods like?
I don't know. Dipti Tamang says, thanks, Sarah, for the insightful talk. How do you think the capitalist colonial relations of productions as it plays out in the tea gardens is different from or similar to the plantation settlement in Kalimpong, especially in terms of shaping the town's identity and making?
So the way I'd kind of approach that question is what's fascinating to me, and like this whole project kind of started around that kind of provocation, and people in Kalimpong often like setting themselves apart from the plantations, right? Setting themselves apart via education, by being able to produce their own food, by health outcomes. And so it's not so much like my like comparison of those things that is interesting. What's fascinating to me ethnographically is how people in Kalimpong actively kind of articulate the Kalimpong versus Darjeeling as a functional difference, right? And like, and how that kind of percolates with political subjectivity in relation to so Darjeeling, as many or Kalimpong, as many of you know, broke off as a separate district from Darjeeling in the recent historical past, and kind of how that kind of, you know, formation of our own district with our own kind of ability to govern ourselves based on land, you know, based on the kind of the uniqueness of these land labor relationships that are very much separate from Darjeeling, and that are mired in the plantation, or it's kind of like the kind of the stuff around this project. It's kind of what made me start asking those questions, or the questions that I kind of talked about today.
Yeah, we have a few more questions. We have a few more minutes, so if there's any last minute questions, please type them in the Q&A. We had a few more follow-up questions from Kath March, but I'll ask one. She said there's a fascinating description of the colonial interest in increasing rents as one of the mechanisms motivating increased maize cultivation. What about potatoes?
I don't know as much about potatoes as I know about millet or maize. But I mean, potatoes are one of the key crops that was experimented on.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't so these like amazing documents that I have for like, you know, many like decades of like, you can kind of see the experimental and so yes, so like potato cultivation is one of those key things. If there was like a hierarchy of crops that they like, that the British kind of like in terms of money making potential. I mean, so there was this like, you should try to like diversify to some fruit, but like that was only kind of a choice for certain farmers because of the land on which they lived. So it was maize and millet, kind of soybeans, and then I would say like potatoes is like the non-grain food that comes next, and then it's like then they're experimenting on rye-sog or mustard greens and some other things, right? So like the potatoes are this like, you know, like you can eat them and you can grow them, but they weren't kind of this prime mover of extension that maize and millet were. And more importantly, like getting people to back off rice, right? Which was also kind of part of the kind of rent escalating scheme, is maize, millet, other and some sort of diversified crops. So like so potatoes could kind of fit into that other stuff. So, and they were all sorts of varieties experimented on. It's yeah. So I haven't totally kind of parsed that out yet.
And what's there, like, I hope I can articulate this. You talk about kind of cultivating the land and kind of Europeanizing it, bringing apricots and other crops, but also cultivating these Anglo-Indians. And was it seen as like kind of the same civilizing mission? Did they use the same language for both the school and the extension, kind of Europeanizing the land and people?
Yeah, I mean, so the farm had this very, very overt dual purpose of like training farmers in Kalimpong, farmers that were not going to migrate, in English vegetable cultivation, right? Mm-hmm. So that one of my main questions, like, what's up with all the celery in Kalimpong? Like that is one of my key research questions, and like to kind of understand, right, the presence of something like celery across the landscape. Oh yeah, but to get the Anglo-Indian men, right, to kind of learn how to grow celery so they can grow it in New Zealand as well. So it's like to have celery have a market in Darjeeling and Kalimpong and these growing hill stations, but also importantly, right, like administrative center for much of the rainy, hot months, right? So there was a market for things like celery, just as an example, in Darjeeling, but more importantly, to train people who, right, were in a place where there wouldn't be celery, say, for example, but who are getting exported as laborers to a place where celery is a desirable commodity.
Or else the celery is for the planters' Bloody Marys.
Yeah, totally. So if anyone knows about celery out there in Zoom world, like, I'm your person. I want to know more about celery.
All right, one last question from Simran Sharma. Says, thank you for the insightful session. Does it make sense to phase out the plantation industry in Darjeeling gradually for a more sustainable agro industry as in Kalimpong?
Oh, that's a huge thing. Yes, like reform, but like whether it's like to be more like Kalimpong is not, because like the whole point of kind of what I'm trying to kind of point is that Kalimpong is as kind of bureaucratized, you know, is as much governed by colonial, normative colonial ideas about land and labor as the plantation. Is just a different kind of modality for that governance. But yes, like, I mean, there are great examples, I mean, in which, you know, plantations could be cooperativized, but the trick is, right, the state of West Bengal thinking about who really owns the land, just like the government was the sole landowner of the Kalimpong government estate, the state of West Bengal is the sole landowner of those plantations, right? So that's a big question.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really great paper and a very generative discussion as well. So this concludes our this event, and we hope to see you all next week. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.